As we begin, we have just a few weeks left, and one thing I'd like to kind of extend. I know we've had a really busy semester, and so between now and April 23rd, which is technically Grace Day is what we're calling it, there are no classes that day. Between now and April 23rd, any work that you have missed, reading quizzes, if there was a piece of the research paper assignment that you forgot, or if you did not turn in your research paper, as some of you did not, you now have the opportunity to turn that work in anytime between now and April 23rd. So if there's anything that you've missed, any of the assignments, you can go back and submit that work, get some credit, hopefully bring up your grade, help your grade out there before the end of the semester. But remember, that needs to be done by April 23rd. We are finishing up today with a few things left on talking about politics in the 20th century before we move into talking about some ways that Christianity adjusted to and was shaped by the culture of the 20th century. And we had finished talking last Wednesday about the rise of progressive evangelicalism, or the liberal version of evangelicalism. Often today, if you would hear somebody talking about the news, or if you would just Google evangelicalism, a lot of what you're going to encounter would focus on conservative aspects of evangelicalism, particularly the politics of conservative evangelicalism, anti-abortion, of course, with the current issues, the issues about same-sex marriage, other things like that. And a lot of that we talked about Wednesday, obviously in just a very brief format, but the rise of the Christian right, as we called it, this politically active conservative evangelicalism. But we don't want to forget, as newspapers and pundits and talking heads often do, is that there was a progressive form of evangelicalism that wasn't just focused on certain aspects of abortion, same-sex marriage, even within some of the extremes of conservatism, trying to make the United States into a theocracy. There was the other side as well. And we talked about Carl Henry as being one of the first people who kind of laid the foundation for this progressive evangelicalism. And what we mean here is a focus on the gospel's application to all parts of life. That what had happened in the 20s and 30s in evangelicalism and fundamentalism was largely a retreat from society, a feeling that America had moved so far away from Christian values and morals that there was this notion of developing a fortress mentality. And we'll talk more about this on Wednesday. But Carl Henry and others in the 40s and 50s felt that there was a need for evangelicals to be involved politically, culturally, and changing society, not just through personal conversion, but encouraging certain political stances as well. And really, it's the evangelical left that provides the groundwork for the evangelical right, the conservative evangelicalism we usually think of. Well, as we mentioned closing on Wednesday, the uneasy conscience of fundamentalism was a very general work. It talked a lot about the idea of social change and the need for Christians to be involved in a variety of social issues, but it didn't have a clear plan on how to do that. And so it was kind of left towards others to kind of figure out, try to come up with some things that would help evangelicals figure out how to go. And basically, as we get into the 1950s and 60s, there are a couple of issues that really held the attention of a lot of people in Christianity, especially in the West and especially in the United States. And we'll focus on some of these as we talk about other aspects, but two big ones, especially toward the end of the 60s, was civil rights and the American conflict in Vietnam. Many evangelicals, especially Carl Henry, were not quite sure where to stand on civil rights. Certainly, a lot of the segregationists in the South often justified segregation through Christian appeals, often very similar to some of the arguments that were used for the institution of slavery in the 19th century. But a lot of other evangelicals, especially in the North, believed that all people were created equal, but they too weren't quite sure what the Christian view on civil rights should be. In fact, a lot of people, especially in the North, took what we might call a gradualist position, meaning that eventually society would work towards civil rights. There wasn't a need for political intervention. There wasn't a need for a massive, full-scale, immediate change. Of course, a lot of other people were pushing for things like the integration of public schools, the end of Jim Crow laws, the other things that inhibited full integration of African Americans into American public life. Billy Graham, for example, would often hold crusades that were integrated, especially in the North, where blacks and whites would come and listen to Graham speak. But he encouraged Martin Luther King to, in his words, put on the brakes. Right? And so it's kind of like he believed in integration, but he didn't think what King was doing was the way to go about it. And so certainly he wouldn't have been supportive of even the more extreme and violent expressions that we see in the 60s as well. Other progressive evangelicals favored federal intervention, forced integration, especially in things like public schools. They were involved in protest marches and demonstrations. And we can see that in the life of someone like John Anderson. Anderson was a white racial activist, not a racist, racial activist, in the sense that he was pushing for civil rights. And one of the things that he was really concerned about was this continued emphasis within evangelicalism that society would transform as people would convert. Right? And so as you converted more people, made more Christians, that would take care of some of the problems. And in a sense, we can understand why people would think that. But Anderson also said that God was not just concerned about souls, he was concerned about bodies as well. And so he wanted to see some things that were more forward-thinking, more progressive. Anderson, when he started, worked at a black fundamentalist college, would eventually join the NAACP, founded the magazine Freedom Now, which was dedicated to convincing fundamentalists to accept equality as biblical. Right? And so the focus of those early years was to try and demonstrate through biblical passages on the equality of the races. Segregation, he said, is a sin. And for a while, he would teach at Wheaton College, that we talked about on Wednesday, one of these evangelical institutions, fundamentalist institution at the time. And while there, would encourage racial concern among the students. The students needed to be concerned about the country and the racism in the country. He would begin incorporating insights from black activists, would also ask them to write for Freedom Now, and was actually very concerned about the influence American culture had on the gospel. His feeling was that a lot of what was preached in American churches was not the gospel, but an Americanized form of the gospel. That so much of American culture and the things that Americans valued had shaped the presentation of the gospel. By the late 1960s, however, he continued to face opposition and resistance from other faculty members and parents and others at Wheaton, and so eventually he was persuaded to leave. One of the things that we see differently about Anderson than we might see in some other evangelicals at the time was his belief in institutionalized racism. Now, essentially what he was saying is that there's a difference between racist individuals. We can understand racist individuals who hold and we would say, even from a Christian standpoint, inappropriate views, unbiblical views about the races and ethnicities. But he also believed that there were things instituted in the systems of American society especially that worked against racial equality. We can think of that in a sense like arguments about separate but equal. Right now, he's writing here in the 1960s. So this is after Brown versus Board of Education, which pulled down the notion of as long as there's equal institutions, you could have a separate, separate entrance for African Americans. You could have other types of, in a hotel or train cars or anything like that, as long as they were equal. Well, often that law protected institutionalized racism because the institutions, the separate things like the separate drinking fountains, the separate hotels, the separate train cars, were often not equal. They were often in a much less, a much deteriorated quality. There wasn't the same kind of services offered to African American customers in a lot of places. And so what you have here is not just racist individuals, but a systematic, institutionalized racism. And some would argue, and I think quite rightly, that some of that still exists. If you think about, again, and some of it may not be intentionally racist, in the sense of somebody, I want to be racist, right? But if you think about laws that would allow children to get funds to go to a private school because the school district they're in is failing. And the school district they're in happens to be in an inner city. And so the justification is, we have these failing schools, and so we're going to give money to certain people so that they can go to private schools. Well, in situations like that, what you might have is, again, unintentionally, but an institutionalized racism, because who tends to live in the inner cities? Right? Tends to be African Americans, immigrants, others, and so you're taking funding that these schools desperately need to succeed, and you're taking it already from this quote-unquote failing school. So essentially, you're kind of making the situation worse in your attempts to make it better. And so those kind of things where Anderson said we have to open our eyes and see these kind of institutionalized forms of racism that aren't just about racist individuals. You can't change a situation like institutionalized racism by changing one person's mind at a time, is the way Anderson would have looked at it. And a lot of other progressive evangelicals saw what Anderson was saying and endeavored to work for the kind of changes he was putting forward. Something similar was going on with the conflict in Vietnam, the Vietnam War. Here too, in the late 60s. Many evangelicals, in fact many Americans in the early years of the war supported American involvement in Vietnam. As the war went on, however, more and more people became more concerned. Now you have to kind of put yourself back in the late 1960s, early 70s, before I was born, by the way. But you have a situation that's completely different than what we have today. In the 1960s, the Vietnam conflict, this was the first essentially televised war. Prior to this point, war happened over there. And so, certainly you would know your loved ones going to war, and you would, understand the impact a little bit if there was some communication by letters or something like that, but you didn't really know the day-to-day kind of things that were going on in the war. Well, Vietnam was different because by that point, the revolution was televised. Right? I mean, there were daily stories about what was going on in Vietnam, body counts, journalists embedded with different army and Navy and other types of armed forces, and filing reports, and so seeing it on your television screen shortly after it happened. And so that was one of the things that caused people to be more concerned, is that they were getting the effects of the war more rapidly than hearing the war stories after someone came home. On the other hand, the great concern from the 1940s on, especially in the United States, was the growth of communism. We talked about this when we were talking about politics last week, of how this concern as communism spread and these Eastern European and then Southeast Asian countries became communist. There were a lot of people in Europe, a lot of people in the United States very, very concerned about the spread of communism. Largely because a lot of communism, at least in the upper levels, the ideologies, was atheistic. And so this concern of, if communism spreads, what will that mean for Western ideals? What will that mean for Christianity? And so a lot of the political policy of the day was the idea of containment. Right? We have to contain communism. And so that was one of the ways that a lot of people were very pro-war. They didn't want to see communism spreading. But as they saw the effects of the war on television, as they had loved ones coming home, being injured from the war, they began to question whether it was, as we've talked about before, a just war in the Christian just war tradition, especially given the amount of violence. Right? We're gradually now, each of these wars that we've gone through in American history and world history, each war brings new technologies to kill people and to break things. Right? We're not going to talk about the Gulf War, the Second Gulf War, but one of the things that we think about in Vietnam, there was the development of Agent Orange, which was essentially napalm and some other types of things that were used to mass violence and mass destruction, and often mass death as well with that. And so you have the dropping of the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II, napalm and some other things in Vietnam, and then in the Gulf War you have the smart bombs, right, which is like this kind of the computer-guided technology. And then we now, of course, have drones, where people can be thousands of miles away piloting a drone to drop a bomb on a terrorist hiding in some cave. And there's this continual separation now of the emotional involvement in the violence, right? It's almost like these people are playing video games. And in fact, that's one of the skills that people look for, the Army looks for in drone, in those people that pilot drones, is, do they have those kind of skills? And so a lot of people began to be concerned, and continue to be concerned, about warfare and the Christian views of warfare. And one of the main figures in this critique, and in progressive evangelicals who's maintained some prominence, is a man named Jim Wallace. He had questioned racial issues as a teen, right? So in his early years, very focused about race, concerns about injustice and racism, something he would continue to be concerned. I don't want to suggest that he stopped being concerned about that. Believed that Jesus was on the side of the poor and the marginalized. He went to Trinity Evangelical Seminary in Chicago, studied theology there for a while, and while on campus, became very vocal in his protest against Vietnam, very vocal about his support of peacemaking and radical generosity, all of which he saw as being consistent with the Sermon on the Mount. Eventually, though, he would stop his studies because his activism took up so much of his time. And one of the things that Wallace wanted to see was a connection between a strong, deep evangelical theology and social activism. For what he saw, conservative evangelicalism and liberal Protestantism failed at least one of these. Right? Evangelicals often had a deep theology, but no social activism. Liberal Protestants were socially active, but often didn't have a strong theology, a very weak theology. The last progressive evangelical I want to introduce to you a little bit is Senator Mark Hatfield, who died just a few years ago. A Republican senator from Oregon, was born in the 1920s. And his father and mother both had stable jobs, I believe, as teachers. And so they managed to weather the Great Depression fairly well because of their stable jobs. He would eventually become very politically active at the age of 10. As early as the age of 10, he was handing out campaign literature. He would work for the Secretary of State of Oregon in college. And it's in his service in the Navy in World War II that really opened his eyes to some things about war. He saw the devastation of the nuclear bombs on the island of Japan. When he came back to the United States after the war, he studied political science at Stanford and actually taught for a while as a professor. But still there was this political ambition that he had. Eventually he was elected to the state legislature of Oregon, would become Secretary of State in Oregon, and the governor in Oregon, a very popular one. But ultimately he was a progressive Republican, which was a lot of what Republicans were up through the 1960s. Although Hatfield was very socially conservative on abortion before it was the thing to be as an evangelical. Right? And we talked a little bit about that last week, how abortion was looked upon as a Catholic issue by evangelicals. Not that they were necessarily supportive of it, but it wasn't this massive resistance to it like there was in Catholicism. But Hatfield was very vocal about his opposition to abortion. But he was also concerned about labor issues, right? Making sure that workers were not exploited and that they had minimum wages to live on. He was concerned about aid to the poor and the elderly. He was concerned about humanity's impact on the environment. And also whether Vietnam was a just war. He was elected senator in 1966, and he becomes very anti-war as Vietnam begins. Between 1967 and 1968, the middle of 1968, he gave 150 anti-war speeches. So in a year and a half, he's very active in his resistance to the war. He was considered for the vice presidential ticket when Nixon ran the first time in 1968, but ultimately he wasn't chosen. And actually, once Nixon was elected, Hatfield worked against some of Nixon's policies, especially related to Vietnam. And so what we see here, in very brief overview, we could say a lot more, and we could focus on other aspects of this as well in other places, is a progressive evangelicalism attempting to work politically to apply the Christian message to other parts of life, and not just what happened in church, or not just individual conversion. Ultimately, though, the political evangelical left did not have much success. Ultimately, because of their nature as progressive evangelicals. So other liberals, right, people that might have been supportive of the same causes about civil rights and protest against war in Vietnam, one of the things they didn't like about progressive evangelicals is that they had a very conservative theology, right? And that they believed the Bible was true. That they believed that the Bible should be followed. And that often meant they viewed certain things about the relationship between men and women, other types of socially conservative issues, even though they were progressive in other issues. And so liberals who weren't evangelicals didn't like them because of that, and so didn't support them because of that. And then conservative evangelicals liked the theology, but didn't like their politics. Right? And so they didn't often find themselves lining up in the same kind of ways with what progressive evangelicals wanted to see done politically. And so ultimately, conservative evangelicalism develops this kind of religious right approach that we talked about last Wednesday, which was much more embraced by conservatives, especially Republicans. What questions do you have? Anything I need to clarify about the evangelical left? Of course, we've been just a brief overview. A lot more we could say.